Some backstory. I live in an area where the only large animals around are deer. This is going to sound cliche, but this happened at a national park. This happened in early fall, around 3 years ago. Me and a friend of mine decided to go down to the water and check out a small boat which had run ashore and was left abandoned. We walked to the boat around 9 p.m. and it was nothing special. Nothing was on board, and there was nothing interesting about it, so we decided to keep walking down the trail the boat was on. The trail is lined in tall grass, maybe 5 to 8 feet high, on both sides. Up ahead, the trail curved, so you couldn't see ahead more than 20 feet or so. As we walked around the curve, we noticed something walk out of the tall grass, maybe 15 feet ahead on the right, and cross into the tall grass on the left. It's hard to describe what I saw, but it looked like a torso with legs and a head, completely white, with no other extremities, probably about 5 feet tall. It just casually walked across our path, not noticing us, right into the tall grass. My friend was noticeably shook up, and so was I, but I simply wrote it off as the moonlight illuminating a deer oddly. She accepted that answer, and we walked back to my car. Afterward, we saw some deer hanging out in the grass a few miles away, and we both agreed what we witnessed was no deer. It turns out, a man was found dead along the water a week or two prior to my sighting. I'm not the biggest believer in spirits, but it would make sense to me. I've gone back with a group of people hoping to see something again, but I never have. Everyone I tell writes it off as a joke, calling it the walking legs. My husband and I recently went and watched The Wolf of Snow Hollow, and I was gushing to my in-laws how fun the movie was. While on the topic of werewolves, I shared this story this past weekend with them, and I creeped them out. Years ago, I was working at a veterinary clinic, and I was kennel staff. We provided dog boarding, and I frequently worked the weekends tending to the dogs, making sure they were walked, fed, and cleaned up after. It was a pretty fun job. One weekend, we had 2 big huskies staying with us. In retrospect, one of them was particularly tall and fluffy, so it might have been a Malamute or Mutt or whatever. Regardless, they were great dogs, and they didn't poop or pee in the kennel. They played outside great, and were super friendly with me. In a word, well behaved. Monday rolled around, and their owners were there to pick them up. For safety, when it came to big dogs, we were only to bring up one at a time from the kennels to the front lobby. I followed that protocol, grabbing the smaller one first. Before I proceed, I have to explain the kennel setup, so this next part makes sense. Where we kept larger dogs was against the far wall of the kennel room. These were large indoor runs, about 15 by 15 feet, and both huskies stayed together in one such run over that weekend. The walls were made of stainless steel for easy disinfecting, and about 15 feet in height. The front wall of the kennel was this special kind of reinforced glass, so you could see the entirety of the kennel from outside of it. Also of interest, we only had one other guy staffed at the vet clinic, and he was about 5'10" in height. So, I brought out the first dog, and there was lots of happy yelping and husky talk. Those of you who own huskies know what I mean, when the dog was reunited with family. I brought up the second dog, and he or she was very reserved, tail wagging, and just generally happy. The owners didn't say a lot to me, other than thanks and have a good day, and they didn't stay long once they had their dogs back. We generally had owners pay first before we brought dogs up from the kennels, because it made it easier for the owners to not have to juggle their wallets and an excited dog. Task done, I went back to the kennels to clean up and get it ready for the next round of dogs to come in. I grabbed the spray bottle of disinfectant and made ready to clean the walls. And that's when I saw it. High up above me, about 15 feet up on the back wall, was a human handprint. And it wasn't a standard size either. It was huge. Looking at it, I was thoroughly creeped out and got the handprint wiped off the stainless steel quickly using a multi-step stool. I'm 5'5". I told my coworkers and the vet techs about it, and they were creeped out too and asked me not to bring it up again. I was the only one working kennels that morning. Between bringing up the last dog and returning to the kennels, there was not enough time for our only male staff member to run in, jump up, and leave a single handprint. I asked him later if he'd been in the kennels at all, and he said no. Apparently around that time, he was doing intake in a vet room. And like I said, the handprint was too big to belong to any normal-sized human. And that's the story of how I inadvertently took care of a well-behaved werewolf for the weekend. About 5 years back, my close friends and some of my family rented a cabin in Zion National Park. It was a beautiful wooden cabin on a cliff overlooking a valley. We were the only occupied cabin of two in a very isolated area. One of my close friends had recently lost her husband in an unexpected way, leaving behind a young daughter. She was hesitant to come with us due to the recent loss, but also because Zion was their last major trip together. Regardless, she pulled herself together and made the trip with us. Our first night there, we decided to tell ghost stories. It's the only logical thing to do in a massive cabin in the middle of nowhere. My friend shared her experience regarding her daughter. The loss of her husband was hard on both of them. She shared with us that her daughter sees him almost daily. She was about 3 or 4 at the time. Her daughter would often have conversations and say things such as, "He's waving to us," or "He's sitting next to us." My friend continued and asked us why he had not shown himself to her, in person or in her dreams. Anything to let her know that he was okay. We informed her that he would show himself when he was ready. The night continued. My sister and her husband were in the living room on their phones. The rest of us were in the kitchen cooking dinner and chatting. Dinner was almost ready, so I went to the living room to let my sister and brother-in-law know. Both of them were quiet, looking at their phones. My brother-in-law looked up and said, "I think someone's here." And my sister confirmed, "Yeah, I saw it too." They described what they saw. He said he saw a torso and head float by and go into the restroom, and my sister confirmed. Both were trying not to panic in order not to freak everyone out. Soon after, the bathroom door opens and it's my friend. She faintly overheard what we were talking about and asked what they saw. My brother-in-law and sister described it to her again. A silhouette of a man, just a torso and head, which went into the restroom where my friend was at. By this time, everyone in the cabin was anxiously listening. My friend began crying. It was her husband, she said. And when he passed, he was an organ donor. They took his arms and legs for harvesting. This happened on the way to EMS class about 4 years ago. I've been looking for somewhere to post ever since. I'm hoping to find others who experience the same thing, or something similar. I was driving, and my brother was in the passenger seat, reading the assigned chapter for that week out loud. We were coming up on an exit when I saw the thing coming down the eastbound freeway ramp. I had to call it a thing because I have no idea what I saw. It moved so fast. To give an idea how fast, we were about 50 yards away, and I saw it at the same time I heard it zip by. It looked like a ripple, like if you saw a heat distortion, but throttling forward. It registered as a momentary blur. I don't have a reference for what I saw, so my brain instantly tried to reject it. It happened so fast I didn't even react. Not so much as a what the fuck. I didn't even mention it. I will say this though. Traffic was heavy enough that it seems unlikely no one else saw, and I'm baffled that it could maneuver at that speed without colliding with other vehicles. I didn't think about it again until the next time we passed that exit, but even then, I thought about it for maybe a second. When we passed by the exit again about a week later, my brother blindsided me. He said, "Bro, we have to talk about that blur." Apparently, he looked up from his book and saw the same thing I did, but his take was a bit different. He claimed that he'd been trying to talk to me about it all week, but every time he tried, his whole train of thought derailed. His take definitely gave me the creeps though. He believed that whatever we saw was actively trying to make us forget about it. He also said that he'd practiced saying the phrase, "We have to talk about that blur," several times that day, just to make sure that we talked about it. My best guess is that we saw an alien vehicle. I wish I had more to say on this, but it's all I have. If this has ever happened to you, I'd love to hear about it. I saw a shadow person. I was out parked on a backcountry road, and I was with two of my friends. It started out as a low dark blur. I thought it was a bush at first. It was through the windshield in plain view of all three of us. Then, it morphed into what looked like a crouching person with his head facing downward. Before our eyes, he slowly stood to full height, head still pointed downward with his chin to his chest. Once he came to full height, his head rolled out to look directly at us, and then he disappeared. Naturally, both of my friends were freaking out. I was exhilarated because I'd never seen such clear evidence of the unknown before. I finally drove away at their insistence, but I know all three of us saw the same thing, and that it was fucking real. It had an air of malevolence to it that sent shivers down my spine, but I was on a high the whole rest of the night. Shadow people are real. My friend introduced me to a friend of theirs. They seemed normal enough, just they had kind of odd facial features. They weren't ugly or anything. Their face was just very doll-like. Large prominent eyes, triangle-shaped face, and a button nose. What stood out were the eyes. They were a little too large for the rest of the face. When they were alone with me, they were talking with me, and the conversation spun into weird stuff, like stuff you can do with your body that others can't. I said to them that I could wiggle my ears. Then, they started. I don't know what the word is for this. Shape-shifting? They showed me their body bending in places that it shouldn't, like a broken arm, dislocated wrist, and this thing where they quite literally tied themselves into a knot by tying their feet behind their head while they were lying down. When they were getting into these positions, I could hear cracking and popping, and I asked them if it hurt, and they said no. When they stood up, their legs were bending the other way. They could make their neck look broken. It was extremely unnatural looking, and they were amused at my confusion. Shortly after, their friend came back and said they needed to go, so they went. I spent the rest of tonight wondering what the fuck happened. I took sleeping pills last night, so I don't know if I'm hallucinating or not. Alright, so I was scrolling on TikTok and came across these videos claiming that they were hearing sounds of skinwalkers or something. I'm no conspiracy theorist, so I brought it up in conversation with my friends, saying it would be stupid to believe something like that exists. As we talk about it more, a memory resurfaced. For context, my backyard is a small 10-acre section of woods with a creek running through it, and my house is built up so it doesn't flood. I live in Wisconsin. I think I was about 8 or 10 when this happened, so about 5 to 7 years ago. Me, my mom, and baby sister were walking down toward the creek just to have some fun in the water and play on the swing set we had built. I remember I ran down faster than my mom because she was carrying my sister. As I turned the corner from our lawn to the trail leading toward the creek, I saw, what I remember, a very tall, naked man or woman, but I remember thinking man just because of the way it was built. They were leaning on a tree. I screamed and ran back to my mom yelling. I just asked my mom if this happened, and she remembered me doing this. Not the big naked man though, but she wouldn't have been able to see it anyway. We went inside after, and my mom called my dad because she thought there was some kind of paddle or something outside, because of the way I described it. All I remember about it was tall. The tree is still there, and it has a metal sign on it from when my parents got married, which is probably about 5 or 6 feet up. The creature, or whatever's waist, was at that level. The other thing that stuck out in my mind was that it had no genitals, like completely smooth crotch. I know it's really weird, but when I picture it in my head, that's what I see first. Also, it was hairless, I think. My mom is a devoted Catholic, so after she figured out it wasn't some child predator, she prayed that the crazy in my head would go away, or something like that. After I finally worked up the courage to go down there again by the swing set, my child mind pretty much forgot about it completely for a while. Up until now. I really want to know that I wasn't just seeing things. I haven't done any research or anything on these so-called skinwalkers or other creatures before typing this out, in fear that it might alter my memory somehow. If you guys know what I saw, please let me know in the comments. But I hope I was just a stupid kid with a big imagination. This happened about 15 years ago, I would estimate, and it happened in Lincoln County, Kentucky. Some of my family and I were visiting our grandma's house there. She had a ranch house on a bunch of farm property, and I have a ton of good memories there, exploring the woods and catching various water animals and fish in the ponds. On this day, we were kind of far away, in town at the Dairy Queen, getting some food. We parked in the parking lot to eat our food and ice cream. I can't remember who, but someone in the car pointed out a jet flying oddly low in the sky, and they said that there were silver balls in the air chasing after it. There were 4 of us in the car, I think, and we all saw it and just watched. There was 2 round-shaped silver discs darting back and forth following this jet across the sky. I would estimate they were about 15 to 20 feet across, relatively small. I have never seen anything like it, especially the way they moved. They didn't fly across the sky when they moved. It was almost like they blipped across from space to space. 1 second they were at one spot, and the next half second they were somewhere else. They continued to pursue the jet until it was out of our view. No one ever really talked about it after, which kinda bothers me how apathetic some people are about these things. But I still remember it, and I wanted to provide an account for anyone who might have seen something similar. When I was a kid, my parents and I lived in a small mobile home in a plot that was across the street from the local cemetery. Although I don't remember much about living there, my parents and other family members have told me the stories. I do remember my dad and mom arguing in the middle of the night one time. I remember my dad asking my mom, "Why are you washing clothes at this hour at night?" My mom arguing back that she wasn't, but we could hear the washer and dryer running. I remember coming home and my parents freaking out because all the cabinets and drawers were open. They assumed someone broke into the house, but nothing was ever missing. I do remember one night, multiple shadows entering my room and standing over my bed. I remember thinking it was my parents until moments later, the lights turned on and my mom walked in to check on me. I was so freaked out that I never slept in my own bed again until I was about 9 years old. There's a scene in The Fourth Kind that made me have a breakdown because it felt like a flashback. These are the things I do remember. The rest of the story was told to me by my parents, grandparents, church pastor, and was actually filed in a police report. One night, my parents were outside having a few drinks, and I was inside watching TV. I must have been around 5 or 6 years old. Suddenly, my parents heard me crying and in pain and ran into the house to see what was happening. They saw me hunched over and crying and screaming. My mom ran to me and started asking what was wrong. Then she lifted my shirt to see if something was biting me. There was nothing, but my skin was being pulled in pinches as if it were rubber. My parents were panicked and ran to get the phone to call for help. The moment my dad reached for the phone, the pinching stopped, and the front door slammed open as if something had just ran out. My dad then ran outside to see if he could see anything, but nothing was there. Suddenly, he started hearing a sort of growling coming from under the mobile home. When he looked, all he could see was some red, bloodshot eyes staring out at him and growling. My dad, in a complete panic, pulled out his gun and started shooting at whatever it was. This caught the attention of a police officer who pulled up in front of the house and pulled his gun out on my dad. My dad quickly dropped his gun and told the officer, "Hey, I'm sorry, but something just attacked my son and it's under the trailer." Before the officer could even look, a creature jumped out from under the mobile home, jumped the fence, and started running. The police officer jumped back into his car and started chasing it. At this point, my parents were completely frightened. Since they had no car at the time, they called a friend of my dad and asked them for a ride to my grandparents' house. Once the friend got there, my dad loaded us into the car and was getting ready to leave when the police officer returned. The officer told my parents, "I followed that thing for about half a mile and it just vanished. I don't know what that was, but I suggest you leave the area for the time being, in case it returns." My mom said she had never heard a police officer sound so terrified in her life. As we were driving down the road, my dad's friend looked at the rearview mirror and asked my parents, "Hey, do you guys see that thing running after us? What the fuck is that?" At that very point, the truck jumped as if something had just landed on the cargo bed. My mom started yelling in pain as the back of her hand was being pinched and pulled, just as my skin had been earlier. This continued until my parents reached my grandparents' property. Now, my grandparents have always been super religious. They're one of the founding members of their church, and they used to host Sunday Mass at their home before the church had enough saved to buy a building. The moment my mom walked into the front gate, the pinching and pulling stopped. My parents ran into my grandparents' home screaming and crying. My grandparents assumed that my parents were either drunk or on some kind of drug, but once they saw the look in all of our eyes, they decided to call the pastor immediately. As soon as pastor arrived, her first words were, "I don't know what's going on, and I don't want to panic you, but I feel something extremely hostile right outside of this home." They immediately started praying. My mom said she opened her eyes during the first prayer and looked outside the window and could see red, bloodshot eyes staring into the house. That night, my mom also claims that during the middle of the night, she awoke and heard 3 knocks on the window. She said she could see outside the window a tall creature walking back and forth right outside of the gate. She said she thought it was odd, almost as if the creature couldn't enter the property. After that night, things apparently calmed down, and nothing really weird happened in that trailer again. Although, my parents did move out a few months later. But even the renters and the people who now live there claim nothing has happened to them. But something is definitely there, and it remembers us. My parents drove past it one night, and they saw 3 dogs jump from out of the cemetery and perched themselves like birds on the fence, watching our car drive by. I had my first ever car accident on the same street, in front of the cemetery too. I suddenly lost control of my car and crashed into a gas pipe. My grandmother has since passed and was buried in that cemetery, and since then, nothing has happened. I like to think she's putting those creatures in their place, acting as a guardian angel.